honey. All right, we'll pick up here. I have a feeling we're not going to get completely through, but you have heard enough, probably heard many lessons or many funeral remembrances of the worthy woman at the end of chapter 31. So you probably got a pretty good understanding of that anyhow. So let's pick back up here in chapter 26 and question number 11. This is a fine place to start. Where is verse 11 quoted in the New Testament? That'd be in 2 Peter chapter 2 at verse 20. It's not a very pretty picture, but it does describe an apostate to a clean sow back to wallowing and a dog returning to his own vomit again. Not a very pretty picture at all. Number 12. After many passages degrading fools or properly recognizing a fool as a fool, what does verse 12 place? Where does verse 12 place the person who's conceited? He's even worse off than a fool. Now, ain't that amazing? You think you're dragging the bottom of the barrel with a fool, but lo and behold, the conceited person is even below him. There's more hope for a fool than there is for the person who's conceited. Woe to them. Remember in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 21, woe to them that are wise in their own eyes. They're prudent in their own sight. But as it relates to real wisdom and real prudence, they're lacking severely. Number 13, why was the slothful saying what's said in verse 13? He's making a what? He's making excuses. He's got these imaginary difficulties, inventions of his mind. I can't go to work today. I might get struck by lightning. I better stay right here in the house for self-preservation purposes, which is wrong, of course. Number 14, what does the slothful do a lot of? We already mentioned that. Do a lot of sleeping. Number 15, can a person be so lazy that he's a burden even to himself? He sure can. So he ends up being his own worst enemy. Now, honestly, we know that to be the case relative to the person who doesn't properly desire the truth. He's his own worst enemy that way. But here's a person who wearies himself. He's too tired to feed himself, and thus when he starves, it's his own self's fault. Number 16, why would a sluggard be, as verse 16 mentions? He doesn't consider himself to be foolish, does he? He considers himself to be wise, and with the whole multitude of wise men, he's got better judgment than even them, sadly. No, I'm sorry. I answered with the next verse, with the next question. No, I didn't. Yeah. I mean, here in verse 16, the fellow, he considers himself wiser in his own eyes than the multitude of the wisest men that have ever spoken concerning judgment. Number 17, how can the two actions of verse 17 be compared? If you meddling in another person's business, it's like what? Taking a dog by the ears. And that's a mean dog too. You better be careful because it could be deadly. Number 18, who is a madman, as mentioned here in verse 18? This is a frenzied type of berserk acting wild person, dangerous weapons thrown around with no respect for anybody else's well-being. That's this fella. Number 19, what is meant by in sport? And of course, it's what you'd think it'd be. Just talking about playing, making sport, joking around. But when the joking around and playing ends up excusing evil behavior, then that's when it gets to be wrong, for sure. Number 20, a talebearer is to strife what wood is to a fire. In other words, you've got to have wood to have a fire, and if you want strife, then a talebearer is going to provide you with just exactly what you need. Number 21, are there people who are given to work in trouble? Sure, sadly they are. In a peaceful situation, they will make an absence of that, for sure. Number 22, how are they like wounds? Words can hurt, you know. Sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt you. That's just not true. The words do hurt. They do bring pain. They do bring suffering. And, of course, when they destroy the reputation of an individual, they bring death, in a sense. Number 23, the comparison in verse 23. You got a relatively worthless pot here that's spray painted silver, you know, and it looks pretty, but the comparison is the outside of the person is disguised, and he's got a rotten, evil heart. That's the comparison that's being made there. Sin wears a mask. That's an old sermon of the previous generation that needs to be dusted off and preached again. Number 24, what does dissembleth mean? Well, lying, deceiving, and of course the most classic example of that word and that concept being used in my thinking is recorded by Paul in Galatians chapter 2, when Peter, because of brethren that came from James at Jerusalem, he withdrew himself from having fellowship with these Gentile converts, and he was accused of dissembling or playing a hypocrite by doing that. And of course, then you find the only bad thing that's ever said about Barnabas is that he followed Peter's example. That's the only bad thing ever said about Barnabas, is he followed an apostle's example that wasn't the right example to follow, for sure. Number 25. Why 7? What is the concept of 7 in the Bible? Completeness. Complete whole. So here, evil contemplates its complete work. Number 26. In verse 26, reword that in your own words. Well, here's the way I did it. Hidden hatred will ultimately be widely exposed. Number 27. In verse 27, is that a new thought or a continuation of verse 26? I think it's a continuation. While attempting to hurt others, you end up hurting yourself. It ends up turning on you. Number 28. What is the definition of flattery? Deceptive compliment. They don't really mean it. There's an ulterior motive to it. Oh, that is a beautiful dress. Look like a fat hog in that dress. You know. That's what flattery is. Chapter 27. What would boasting consist of in verse 17? Verse 17? That's not right. Verse 1. Making a show, planning on the morrow, depending on any future movement for spiritual good. That's ungodly boasting. You know, tomorrow or next week or next year, I'm going to do all these wonderful things. Well, you might get you an audience for making that proclamation, but in fact, that's boasting and that's evil. Because you're acting like you know what's going to happen. You know you're going to have time to do all this stuff you're boasting about you're going to do. Number 2, what New Testament passage elaborates upon verse 1 here? Well, James chapter 4, verses 13 through 16 does quite well. You know, today or tomorrow I'll go into the city, continue there a year, but that's not actually chapter 4, is it? That's chapter 3. Is it chapter 4? Okay. Number 3, why is such instruction necessary? Well, often failure of humanity is that we brag on what in fact makes us stink. And of course, sometimes, your justification is, if I don't toot my own horn, then nobody will. So I got to. Now that's not right. Number 4, why does God not want us to praise ourselves? Because it is destructive, spiritually destructive for us to do so. And of course, any instruction that God gives us is ultimately for our benefit. And even if we don't understand it right off the bat, with contemplation and maturity, then we will and see that it's actually destructive for us to do so. Number 5, heavier than what? Any material is, any weight you can imagine is lighter to bear than a headstrong, conceited, envious boaster, is what's associated here. Number 6, do you detect similarities and differences in the structure of verses 3 and 4? Well, wrath and anger may arise and subside, but jealousy has the tendency to continue on and on and on and on and on. And of course, the brief amount of time that wrath and anger demonstrate themselves may lead to a conclusion that they're not in existence, whereas jealousy is something that keeps on keeping on. Number 7, better in what sense, or what senses in verse 5? Open rebuke is better than secret love. It's more beneficial. It's better in the sense that it's to be desired because it actually has something that will benefit the person who is the recipient of the rebuke. Number 8, faithful in what sense? In verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend. What, the faithful and wounds? That don't sound like it goes together. But here the wounds are provided for a good benefit. They are to bring about discomfort, maybe even pain, but the end result of the discomfort and pain is the reform that takes place in the person and the correction that takes place. And so those are truly the wounds of a friend, that we need more friends like that who will wound us that way. Now you talk about the way up being down and backwards being forward. That's the way it is in comparison to the world and the way the world oftentimes thinks. Number 9, what does deceitful mean? That should be verse 6 instead of 7 if you've got 7. Lavish, abundant, but it only touches the outside, the surface. It's not deep down. It's not enduring. Number 10, what does loatheth mean? All right. And here, the warning here is of overindulgence, obviously, and that's considered less than valuable for sure. Number 11, what is the comparison in verse 8? A wandering bird to a wandering person. And of course, both ends up with sad results, for sure. Number 12, what does the last statement of verse 9 mean? There is nothing more burden-bearing and sweeter than good advice and the counsel of a friend. That's the comparison that I would make, certainly, off of this particular verse. Number 10, or number 13 from verse 10, how does verse 10 depart from this usual form of a verse? Instead of 2 lines, you got 3. That's the distinction. Number 14, what does verse 10 say about our friendship ties? We value long-term friendships of family as well as those friends you have made, family friends from way, way, way back. Friends that started off being your parents' friends or your grandparents' friends, and then there's a long, continual friendship all the way down to the present. Number 15, in what sense should one not go into his brother's house during calamity. Well, if you're not really close, it could be a dangerous place to be, for sure. Think about the example of while they were kin, were David's sons a real close-knit group? Why, no, obviously not. They weren't. As a matter of fact, David even would make the affirmation concerning himself as compared to the rest of his brothers that he was closer to Jonathan than he was to his brothers. So that doesn't surprise us. Number 16, why will people reproach a man because of his unfaithful children? Because it seems to reflect on him, sadly. Now, whether that's justified and fair or not, that's not what we're talking about here. But here's an individual who's attacked, and his character is attacked because of what his offspring do. Well, that's just, and of course you go all the way back to the very first offspring. Can we blame God for the foolishness of Adam and Eve? Well, of course not. Because Adam and Eve possessed free moral agency themselves and chose to do just exactly what the Lord said don't do. So the same thing would have application here. But people do jump to the conclusion that if something bad happens in the offspring, it's the parent's fault. All the time. But that's not fair. Number 17, how would you illustrate verse 12? Well, a person walking off a cliff while talking on his cell phone would be one way. Have you seen pictures of people walking down the street and all of a sudden there's an open manhole and they're gone? Whoa, wow. That's preoccupied with something. You got to pay attention to business. You got to. The wise person sees pitfalls, open places to fall, evil and bad, but not the foolish person, not the simpleton. He doesn't do that. Number 18. What is the meaning in verse 13? It's very similar back to chapter 20 at verse 16. That clothing could be, the security that a person would use when borrowing money. You know, I'm going to let my clothes serve as collateral or whatever. Well, if you look at my clothes, that's a pretty poor credit risk for sure. You're not going to get anything with my clothes for sure. The person in his right mind, there's the person who is in his right mind will not choose to be good for a stranger's debts. That just won't do that. That doesn't make any sense. Number 19, what kind of person would bless his friend with a loud voice? And here you might look at that and say, well, that's a positive thing. But the positive, it's not positive here. It's similar to the show off, to the braggart, to the person in Matthew chapter 6 who says, look at how much I gave to the poor. Listen to how wonderful I prayed. All those things. Listen how long I've prayed. Ain't I a righteous man? Well, that's all pretentious. When I spoke on this verse on Good News Today, I found a proverb, an Italian proverb of all things. It says this: he who praises you more than he who was wont to do has either deceived you or is about to do so. So if he's building you all up, then don't be surprised if he's fixing to take you down right after he gets through talking about how wonderful you are. Number 20, what is the comparison in verse 15? Well, it's the same comparison, a flat roof, the drip, drip, drip of the water, a brawling, contentious woman. If she happens to be your wife, then you'd rather be outside in a snowstorm than having to listen to that. Number 21, what is meant by the last statement, verse 16? It's talking about the impossibility of concealing such a woman as this. I mean, it's like stopping the wind or keeping perfume from stinking. You can't, it's impossible to do. Number 22, which iron sharpeneth iron? What's the idea here? Is it actually iron that's sharpening iron, or is it the influence of men have upon each other that makes each other better. Well, that's the idea. Or cheers one up when they need cheering up, making their countenance alive and happy. Number 23, where does Paul state the same truth as verse 18? That's 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 6. The husband that laboreth is worthy of his hire. He must first take of the fruit that he produces. He is the partaker of those fruit. In other words, well, what's another way to say that? You get paid for what you do. If you do work, then you ought to be able to receive benefit from the work that you perform. And as it relates to a husbandman, even so to a soldier, or even to a preacher of the gospel. Number 24, elaborate on the comparison that's made in verse 19. As a person can look at his exact representation or reflection in the water, so he sees himself in the way other people see him. In other words, that can be a positive thing or a negative thing. While all you can look at when you see your reflection in a mirror is you see your physical self as you really are. Obviously, God's Word has the ability as the mirror of the soul to show us as God sees us, but also that reflection in the life of another person. A person makes a determination about us when they see us. Here's somebody that I want to talk to, or here's somebody I'm going to run the other way from. How do they make that determination? Well, it can be a positive thing, or it can be a negative thing, and it has to do with our dealings with us prior to that time. Number 25, what is the New Testament word from Greek that is parallel to hell in Hebrew? Hades. And the word Sheol, notice Hades, death is Thanatos, the grave in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 15. And of course, Matthew chapter 16, mistranslated hell, should be Hades there. And then when Peter is quoting from David, thou shalt not leave my soul in hell, in Acts chapter 2, verse 27, that's not hell, it's Hades. Jesus did not go to hell. Number 26, what does destruction, and the word that's translated destruction in the American Standard is translated Abaddon. What does that mean? It simply means death, the destroying power. And it's personified. In other words, here's a characteristic that's pictured with human characteristics as never being satisfied. And the comparison is to the covetous person. He's like that. Death's never satisfied, wants more and more and more. And the covetous person wants more and more and more. Even though Jesus would say that a man's life consisteth not in the abundance of the things that he possesses. Number 28, here's some words that are not usually used in my vocabulary: a bray, a mortar, and a pestle. What are those things used for? All right, they're used for mixing and crushing. Now, sometimes if you're a pharmacist, old-timey kind, and you mix stuff together and making medicine. But if you're trying to get wheat separated from the husk, then the bray was to pound the wheat in a mortar or a container, and the pestle was the pounding utensil that you use to separate the wheat from the husk. And the point he's making here is that a fool can't be separated from his foolishness. I mean, you can do that to grain, but with a fool, you can't make him any better. It won't separate. Now, the sure sign that you're not a fool is if you don't keep on being one, that this don't apply to you. See? So we do have hope. Number 29, why such instruction is found here in verse 23. Well, from here to the end of the chapter, he's talking about agricultural material, other than verse 24, we'll see. Whatever one's business is, if you don't take care of it, you'll lose it. Now that's whether it's a field of soybeans or whatever it is, where it's a herd of cows, whatever it is, you got to take care of it. Number 30, illustrate verse 24 by the offering of Solomon. What about offspring? Who was Solomon's offspring? Rehoboam. Did Rehoboam prize the position that he was in as king? Of course not. And so he ends up, while he has a crown today, he don't have it tomorrow. Or he doesn't have the whole kingdom because of his foolish choices. So the very highest of honors that you can receive are very, very limited. Even if you have a long, successful career, compared to eternity, it's a drop in the bucket for sure. Number 31, what's the point in verse 25? When it comes to taking care of a flock, does a shepherd have a responsibility of making sure that he rotates the pastures and makes sure that his sheep, goats have something to eat? Sure he does. So there's regular processes, there's care and concern that the shepherd has to. It's not just walking around out there and looking at the beautiful scenery. It's making sure that the sheep are cared for and have sufficient to eat, and he's watchful for wild animals that will take his flock. Number 32, what is the meaning of the goats or the price of the field? That simply has the idea that diligence involved in agricultural industry has its reward. You know, if you couldn't make a living off of being a farmer, and of course we've got to the point now where a lot of people, they work another job and then because they can't live off being a farmer. But there is a reward that goes along with it. I mean, the eggs that you get from your chickens, the milk you get from your cow, the wool you get from your sheep, all those different things. Number 33, why did they not use cow's milk like we do? Because they didn't have cows. They drank goat's milk. Have you ever drunk goat's milk? I hadn't, I don't think. But there was enough for everyone. All right, chapter 28. Cite a few Bible examples of righteous men who could properly be classified as being bold as lions. Well, into that number, I would put Moses, I'd put Joshua, I'd put Noah, I'd put Elijah, I'd put, at times, Elisha, I'd put Micaiah, and Jeremiah. I'd put the apostles in that category. And the idea there is they're going to say and do the right thing and not back down, even though they are vastly outnumbered and their life could in fact be taken by those that are their enemies. Number 2, what's the meaning of for in verse 2? The idea is because of the wickedness of society, the turnover in leadership happens often. And then, as it should work, the better the leadership, the longer the tenure of the leadership. Bad leadership, get rid of it. Good leadership, keep them for a long time. That's a sensible way for it to work. Number 3, what is the implied contrast in verse 2? Well, it's the difference between good government and bad government, as well as good leaders and bad leaders, good princes and bad princes, people in powerful positions, either being good or being bad. Number 4, comment upon the comparison in verse 3. The poor who oppresses one that's even poorer than he is, it's the picture that he's doing. It's like a sudden flood that comes and takes away all his possessions. That's the comparison that's made. So a person that's poor could really find another person who is lacking more than he is and take advantage of him, sadly. And you would think if a person was in that position, then they would be the very ones that would have mercy on somebody that would have it worse off than they did, but instead, they take advantage of their position anyhow. Again, showing that that degree of lack of respect and covetousness to a degree is not limited to those who have a whole lot, because here someone poor is taken advantage of. Number 5, who praise the wicked? Well, the wicked do. Wicked breakers of the law applaud wicked breakers of the law. There's a saying, birds of a feather flock together. And that's true. They encourage each other in their dastardly ways. So while it doesn't make any sense for anybody to praise those that are wicked, you can always find somebody that'll applaud your ungodliness because they're ungodly themselves. Number 6, what do the obedient do to the wicked? They have to contend with them. In other words, they have to stand against them because they do not want to aid and abet and extend fellowship to that which is wicked. So they have to literally oppose them. Have no fellowship with unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. So says Paul in Ephesians chapter 5 at verse 11. Number 7, do evil men ever get into the field of judging? Sadly, they do. And when you've got evil people in positions of judging, and even to the point where they're judges, then you're in a heap of trouble. Number 8, verse 6 contrasts the honest poor man with the perverse rich man. Then, of course, the obvious question then is, which had we rather be? Rather be the honest poor man than the rich perverse man. Number 9, what is the implied contrast in verse 7? Wise young men obeying the law when you've got righteous young men breaking the law. And, of course, the end result of the violent lawbreaker is that they bring shame upon their parents. And specifically here mentioned is the father. Number 10, what was God's law to Israel about usury? And what does that usury mean anyhow? It's interest. Talking about you don't take advantage of individuals with exorbitant percentages, loan sharks. You know, there was a time in which loan sharks would charge something like what credit cards do today, and yet they're not called loan sharks. That don't make no sense. If they were loan sharks and they were charging 26, 28% interest as a part of the mafia, then how come all of a sudden it's not loan sharking today when the rates are just as high? And of course, it takes advantage of people in bad situations. Like what are the businesses now? You know, title loans and all that. You could probably get a loan or if you got a title to an artificial leg, then people would do it, you know, to get the money. Number 11, what would be a modern example of one turning away his ear from hearing God's law? Well, if people don't respect God's word, if people don't read God's word, then that's pretty well a clear indication that they do not respect God's word. Number 12, who might cause the righteous to go astray? Evil person. A person who is a buddy of Satan. A person trying to pervert a converted person to do that which is evil is truly an ungodly person. And sadly, because it makes them feel less, and so if they can get someone to go along and engage in the activity they're doing, which is wrong, then their conscience don't bother them near as much because they've got a so-called better person to do what they're doing.
Or everybody does it.
Everybody does it, yeah. Like Mama used to say, if Freddie, Clayton, if everybody's jumping in the fire, are you going to jump in the fire? You know? If everybody's jumping off a cliff, you going to jump off a cliff? Number 13, are all poor men ignorant men? No, that's The proverb don't say that, does it? The poor that has understanding and sees through the rich, conceited person, he's obviously not ignorant because he sees that. Number 14, in verse 12, is verse 12 referring primarily to rulers? Well, probably so. But because when the king is good, it affects everybody that's under his kingship. Just as when he's wicked, it does too. You know. Number 15, cite a Bible example of one who tried to cover his transgression, but he was not able to do it. Who? David tried, obviously. 2 Samuel chapter 12, Achan, who took what he wasn't supposed to take at the city of Jericho in Judges 7. So there's many of those. Number 16, cite a Bible example of one who confessed and forsook his sin, and because of that, then he obtained mercy. There's David again, okay? Because he did recognize it. Number 17, in what sense is fear used? Here it's a reference to reverential, godly respect. That's the healthy fear of God that we are to have. Number 18, what would a wicked ruler do to his people? He would act like a roaring lion or a charging bear, is the picture here. And anybody that got in his way, he's going to destroy them. That's what a wicked ruler would do. Number 19, whom does his covetousness oppress? The very ones he's supposed to be helping, sadly. Instead of receiving the assistance they need, they're being hurt by his attitude and action. Number 20, is verse 17 a capital punishment verse? Sure is. Along with Genesis chapter 9 at verse 6 is also. Number 21, is verse 18 another contrasting verse? Sure. The idea being if you walk uprightly, then consequences come your way. If you walk perversely, then consequences come your way too. So what kind of consequences you won't come in your way? Well, decide which way you're going to walk. Number 22. Describe one who is following vain persons. If he's vain, that's just another word for worthless. So if you're following a worthless person, then that seems to me that you're you're wasting time engaged in worthless activity, wasting what time there is available. And of course, that's the end result of that type of thing is going to end up with certainly you're going to come to poverty by a situation like that. Number 23, why will the man seeking to be rich hastily suffer punishment? Because his concern is not with what's right and righteousness. His concern is with getting. And so his wrong motivation can only result in wrong consequences, bad consequences in his desire for those things. Number 24, what does a piece of bread refer to here or represent in verse 21? Dishonest partiality leads men who have enslaved themselves to transgress even when the inducement to do so is disproportionate. So here you got a piece of bread, which is not a whole lot for sure. But if a person had a piece of bread, that was in essence saying they didn't have very much at all. They're poor. Their poverty is demonstrated by them having only a piece of bread. Number 25, the evil eye, verse 22, with the lust of the eye in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 or 16. Is that the same thing? Sure is. The evil eye, the envious eye, the desire for what other people have, covetousness, which leads to dishonesty. Number 26, who believes and does not believe the statement in verse 23? Well, the person who's willing to speak the truth, he believes it, while the smooth talker evidently doesn't believe it, or he wouldn't be so categorized. Number 27, how perverse is one described in verse 24? He's so bad that he'll rob who? His parents. He'll rob his own parents. Number 28, why would the greedy stir up strife? Well, it's because they want more for themselves, and so they think that somehow, some way, in their wanting more and their lack of prosperity, then they'll be able to get that by causing problems. Number 29, cite a contrast between the statements in verse 25 and 26. If you put confidence and trust in yourself, then that's probably not going to pay much dividends. If you put confidence and trust in the Lord, then there's big dividends in that. Wonderful consequences will come your way. And number 30, what wonderful promise does verse 27 contain? If a person provides financial and physical assistance for a person who is in need, does he have the assurance that his needs will be met too? That's the way it works, you know. Number 31, the rise here is a reference to getting taller. No, it's a reference to power and influence that a person rises to. All right, we're going to stop right there, and don't have a whole lot left. But what I'm going to give you is the answers and some commentary as well on and definitions throughout the rest of the book. And of course, you can use that in your preparation for the test and all like that. I've got I was trying to make sure that everybody that was taking the class for credit. Of course, anybody can take the test to test yourself and see what all that you've picked up, and it might startle you as to how you have to think about some of these true or false statements. I used to think before I took a bunch of tests in college, I used to think, boy, I love him true or false test. Not anymore. I mean, it's because you can word them in such a way that there can't be but one answer. But and of course it's me. You know, I'll write something and it's brilliant, and then when I read it later on, I can't even figure out what I said. So hopefully that didn't happen in this particular test. So let me make sure that Keith is taking this for credit, aren't you, Keith? And Carla is. And then the Cruzes are. No, is that right? Yeah. And then Roger and Sonia are. And then Paul is. So I'll get them to them, and I will be able to send everybody that's not here, I'll be able to send your material to you online, and you'll have to buy your own stamp. Because if you're here, then your self-addressed stamped envelope is here available, and so you don't have to worry about buying a stamp. But those of you that have just been listening online, then you'll have to provide your own stamp and try to get the test back within a week, at the very longest, a week. I would start with a postmark, but I'm afraid somebody'd say, well, I took it to the post office, but they was backdating the post office. They were backdating it to 2 days before so it could be counted and set. But I'm not going to go there. Is there anything else that y'all would like to ask or I mean, I would pass out a paper and let you tell me everything that was bad about this class, but it's so disheartening when I do that. Yeah, I know you got 10 pieces of paper front and back, and people are just getting started. So I decided for my own feelings, I just wouldn't do that. But I've enjoyed it. I know for a fact if I ever do this again, then I'm not going to do the verse by verse. I'm going to do it in categories, which will mean that some of the verses will be left out entirely, but there will be a greater likelihood that we'll actually conclude the material. So that's that much.
That's learning by what you've done.
That's right. And a fool wouldn't do that.
No fool wouldn't do that.
They wouldn't learn.
Fool would do it the same way
Every time. Keep on having. You wonder why the same results come every time you do it the same way. That's right. All right. Now, for everybody, whether you're taking it for credit or not, you get all the answers to all the rest of the questions in the book. So I've got all that up here, and I can leave it up here on the front. Roger can hand them out to you. I thought I was really doing good, and then one of our silly coffee machines started getting real light. And so I think I've got plenty made, though. And as it relates to the test and the self-addressed stamped envelopes, I will just leave these tests up here, and anybody that wants to take them without credit, but just take them for the fun of it, then you can do that too. And I'll leave the self-addressed stamped envelopes up here and the test, and you can get them and spray them with